You're going to have to adjust this.
Okay, that's all right.
Because I'm shorter than you.
Part of it.
Okay. Welcome, everyone, to our third Stith Thompson lecture, which is sponsored by the Folk Narrative section. We're delighted to have you all here. My name is Linda Lee, and I'm one of the co-conveners, along with Adam Zolkover, of the Folk Narrative section. I have a couple of quick announcements to make, and then I will introduce our wonderful speaker here. The Folk Narrative section business meeting is tomorrow at 12:15 in O'Keefe, which is just across the hall. We invite you all to come and discuss, among other things, our speaker for 2016, which is when our fourth Stith Thompson lecture will be. We also have one more sponsored panel at AFS. On Saturday morning at 8 a.m., there is a sponsored panel called Soldier Talk, Beyond the War Stories, and so we hope that you all will join us there too. You're also welcome to follow the folk narrative section and things that are going on and things that are of interest to people who are interested in folk narrative. You can follow us on Twitter at folk narrative, and Adam will be live tweeting the talk tonight. You can also join the Folk Narrative section's Facebook group, which you can find on Facebook at American Folklore Society Folk Narrative section. And that's an open group, and there are hundreds of people internationally who are interested in folklore and folk narrative who participate there. It's a lively place. Okay. So that's all of my sort of general business announcements. And again, we hope that we'll see you at the business meeting and at the talk on Saturday morning. Okay. Bob Patrick is the director of the Veterans History Project of the American Folklife Center, the Library of Congress. He's been the director since 2006 with the mission of collecting, preserving, and making accessible wartime memories of American veterans. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel, having served more than 28 years on active duty. Previously, he had a leadership role in the creation of the National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., and he was the director of the memorial's dedication in 2004. He's a graduate of VMI, Western Kentucky University, and the Army War College, and he personally is dedicated to the preservation of the memories of American veterans. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Patrick. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Linda. And I personally want to thank Adam. Adam called me, when was it? February, I think, a long time ago, and asked me to do this. And I said, you want me to do what? And I said, I found out what it was. And I said, I absolutely want to do that. And I'm honored to be here tonight to be able to do this, to talk about the Veterans History Project and what I'm calling the challenge of expectations. In his final overseas radio broadcast during World War II, CBS war correspondent and later 1960s news pundit Eric Sevareid reported, I quote, "War happens inside of a man and happens to one man alone. It can never be communicated. That is the tragedy and perhaps the blessing. And I'm sorry to say that is also why, in a certain sense, you and your sons from the war will be forever strangers." I very often use this quote when I make Veterans History Project presentations. First of all, it helps me gauge the age of my audience to see if anyone knows who Eric Sevareid is. We baby boomers who watched Uncle Walter on the CBS Evening News know Mr. Sevareid was a guy who sat next to him to talk about whatever was the editorial of the day. Anyway, I feel this quote really speaks to the heart of what we are doing with the Veterans History Project of the American Folklife Center. We're trying to get some meaning to what is the human experience of war and how we can get veterans to talk about it. In 2000, the United States Congress unanimously created the Veterans History Project. It established VHP, as we like to call it, as a project within the American Folklife Center because it was seen as an appropriate repository to collect, preserve, and make available to the public an archive of oral histories. The American Folklife Center was viewed as having the expertise and the management of documentation projects, as well as the experience to develop cultural and educational programs for the public. For the last 14 years, as of last week, October 27th, we've been carrying out this mission of collecting and preserving and making accessible the wartime memories of America's veterans so that future generations can learn from them. Whenever I talk about VHP, I always like to provide the background of where we really came from, what we are now, how we got there, and what's the value of this project, to give you an idea. I know a lot of people are aware of it, but it's always helpful to kind of do that reference check. Then I'd like to speak about what I said, the challenge of expectations that we face, and not just putting the archive together, but also the various perceptions that are held by sometimes divergent institutions and individuals who have their own ideas of what we should be doing, and maybe even who we are or aren't. So let's go back to the beginning. Our origins are very humble, as it all started in a backyard in La Crosse, Wisconsin, when U.S. Congressman Ron Kine was hearing his father and uncle swapping war stories about the Korean War. And I'm sure the folklorists in the room saw this as a great opportunity for field work, to go into the backyard in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And probably many of us have had that situation before, of hearing our uncles, our fathers, our mothers, whoever, telling their stories. Some of these stories Mr. Kine had not heard before, and maybe thought he wouldn't hear again. So he got out his video camera, and he particularly wanted to save them for his son and make these a part of his family's legacy. Then the way he tells it, the light bulb went on for him that this is happening all over the country, and that men and women, particularly men, particularly from Korea and Vietnam, were telling their stories, and these are stories we need to capture. And he was hearing a lot in the news about how we were losing our World War II veterans. There's a lot of talk about World War II veterans through films like Private Ryan and books like The Greatest Generation, and obituaries that said that we were losing 1,000 of them a day. So he came back to Congress. He talked to members of Congress who were there, thought that they would be interested in starting this project. And as I always say this to the audiences, I'm glad you're sitting down. The unanimous bipartisan support, the United States Congress created what became the Veterans History Project. And the law stated that the wartime remembrances of America's veterans were recorded as either audio or video oral histories and supplemented with collections of original materials. And it was expected that these oral histories would be collected by local voluntary efforts so that citizens of all ages can hear directly from the veterans and their communities. A very grassroots approach. So, after 14 years, how's all this going? It's been said that the Veterans History Project is the largest, most extensive oral history project in American history. I would imagine there are those in the oral history and folklore community that may take some issue with that, but I do think it is safe to say that VHP is clearly the largest archive of its type. Currently, we have nearly 95,000 collections. On average, we receive 125 new collections every week, and almost all of these have been processed or available through the American Folklife Center reading room located at the library. We've been able to digitize 16,000 of these collections, so that, you actually go online and see and hear these and experience these videos. And the predominance of these interviews are the older veterans. About 55,000 of those are from World War II, 12,000 from Korea. And Congress told us to put priority on these older veterans, and I will say now that we're considering Vietnam veterans to start falling in that category. Someone who went through college during Vietnam and was in the Army during Vietnam, I know how old they are, and it's an important time that we capture those stories now. So how's this been done? We've done it as directed, reached out nationwide to create a public participation effort to collect veterans' oral histories. VHP participation comes from a number of organizations, institutions, and individuals. These sources include veteran service organizations, the Department of Veterans Affairs, libraries, historical societies, retirement communities. Members of Congress are actively involved, educational institutions from middle school to graduate level, Eagle Scouts, the National Court Reporters, and on and on and on. But perhaps the most important element that have been captured in these stories are the families and friends of veterans. We've been asking them, our catchline is, who is the veteran in your life? And it could be a family member, it could be a neighbor, it could be a patient in hospice. But who is the veteran in your life? And that's who we're asking people to take the time to capture their story. And literally thousands of different entities are credited with submitting these collections. I go in our processing section once or twice a month and just take a look at what we've got in. And it always amazes me. Everybody thinks, oh, we'll get American Legion and VFW involved, and that really hasn't been the case. But it's in places like the Douglas County Historical Society in Minnesota, the Nashville Public Library, the DAR, Atria Senior Living, and VA medical centers. And I think it's a great testament to this project that it speaks to so many different participants, literally from every state in the Union, every congressional district in the Union. It isn't just the vets down at the VFW, as I said. It is mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers and the neighbors that are willing to talk. However, the variety of these participants can also mean a variety of wants and expectations regarding the ultimate outcome of their collection. So what's happening to the collections? Ultimately, anything coming to the Library of Congress is there to inform and instruct. It's the largest library in the world and serves and services not only members of Congress, but anyone who enters online, or better yet, comes to the library to do research. VHP doesn't quite have the number of researchers that AFC does, but we do get our fair share, 5 or 6 a month, who come in and are using the archive, who are interested in our material. We have historians, of course, and authors and documentarians and teachers. Department of Defense is even taking a look at some of them, and just people with an abiding interest in war stories. We have people wanting to know if World War II veterans have retained the good hygiene habits they learned during the war. You know, brushing your teeth, changing your socks, smoking a pack of Luckies a day, you know, that kind of thing. Or the experience of their young veterans today who are in Iraq and Afghanistan. Teachers are supplementing the 1.5 page that tells the complete story of World War II by piping some of these interviews into their classrooms. And the library has created primary source sets around these stories as well. So the students have experiential learning of history by hearing it from those who actually lived it and took a part in our nation's wars. I've been telling this story the last year or so. I was talking to over at GW, George Washington University. It was a Vietnam veteran who was a graduate level instructor in counseling, in grief counseling. And it was a situation like this where I went in to speak about the Veterans History Project to a graduate level course who were studying grief counseling, and he thought it would be interesting to introduce them to VHP. And I'm starting, 10 seconds into my presentation, and a hand goes up in the back. And I'm an Army guy, and you know my teaching is let me give the briefing, then you ask the questions, all right? So I said, yes, and it was a young lady, and she says, I want you to know I'm here because of the Veterans History Project. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I was given a Veterans History Project assignment in high school, and I interviewed some older member of my community, and that so impressed me that hearing them talk and hearing about their life story, that's what I wanted to do the rest of my life. And so you got into counseling of interviewing older people. One of the golden moments, you know, what this thing does to students and young people. Another outcome of VHP is how it's aiding veterans by providing a structured and important way to tell their story. Remember at the start I talked about war happening inside of those who experience and the tragedy of their being unable to communicate it. There's another quote that we have posted in our information centers by the late Maya Angelou. There's no agony like bearing an untold story inside of you. Any man or woman who serves, particularly during a time of war, has experience that they hold on to. For those who have no idea what they are about, sons, daughters, neighbors, whatever, people who don't understand all this, they can often be a reason for curiosity, probably well-meaning, but not always well-received by the veteran. Well, veterans may just talk about the good times, the funny times, his best pal, what he did when he went on R&R, those fond memories that they have. The problem is that it's not the complete story. That many veterans want to tell, the complete story that many veterans want to tell, and there hasn't been a vehicle to do it. I like to think that VHP can be and has been the chance for veterans to tell a complete and personal account of their military experiences. Believe me, many has been the time with an interview when we've been told by the interviewer, you know, his wife told me she'd been married to her for 50 years and never heard that story before. Veterans hold these stories inside, and that's another conversation altogether as to why they won't tell their stories or are reluctant to tell their stories I won't go into. But the magic moment for me in an interview is when you're talking to a veteran. He said, you know, I've never told anybody this, but. And they start telling something that literally they have held within them and not told a soul for the whole time. It's generally the older veterans. A Veterans History Project interview can be therapeutic and healing. PTSD is not new. Well, I think we all know that. It has gone by other names, shell shock, battle fatigue, but there is evidence that being able to relate their stories in a serious and meaningful way can be of value to those who suffer from the mental burden of war. And there have been some studies that this whole telling your life story, particular story in the military, can be very therapeutic and can bring some people out. One final thing that relates to what I just said, VHP interviews can be a great gift to a family. This is probably the most personally satisfying and perhaps unforeseen outcomes of this project. Veterans truly give a gift to their family when they tell their stories. I won't get into the whole, as I said, the whole discussions of why they haven't told their stories with their closest family members, but many, many have not. However, when they do, it can only be a release for them, but also a time of enlightenment for families. It can be an experience that can result in a new appreciation of who these veterans are, what they've done, maybe even why they have certain habits. A VHP interview provides a new chapter to a family's history or legacy that otherwise will remain empty. We have wonderful examples of veterans bringing their family members to the Library of Congress so they can personally present us with their interview. We also have testimonies from sons and daughters about how much it means to them to be able to hear their veteran's voice even after they're gone. Recently, we were asked to provide a replacement copy of a VHP interview to a widow who had literally worn out her recording of her husband's voice. I often say that VHP staff not only perform their responsibilities in a professional manner, as would be expected, but they also do it with a great deal of heart and emotional involvement. A senior reference specialist recently wrote in her blog that she has a job that consistently brings her to tears, but it does so in a healthy way. So all of that is the what and why of who we are, and I trust I've talked enough through that you get an idea that VHP finds itself answering to a variety of audiences and masters who have great expectations for this important nationwide effort. We were created and funded by the highest level of government. We are housed in the largest library in the world. We are hosted at a premier organization like the American Folklife Center. We are largely dependent on amateur documentarians and oral historians. As I like to say, we ain't talking Ken Burns and Forrest Pogue here. We pay tribute to a segment of our society who are generally held in the highest regard, and we are accessed by experts and scholars who have great expectations of what we can provide. Each of these groups comes with their own expectations of what is VHP. At this point, I'd like to talk a little bit about what these expectations are, where some run into each other, and where we attempt to bring some reality to the whole situation. So let's talk about Congress. It is with little trepidation that I say that U.S. Congress appears to be maintaining its unanimous bipartisan support for the Veterans History Project. We have worked with hundreds of congressional officers, and not a one has expressed any dissatisfaction towards VHP and its mission. But who in Congress is really going to talk down a veterans program these days? They pass out our literature, put us on their website, mention us in their speeches, and sponsor workshops and interview events. They fence in our budget. They speak in glowing terms about us during testimonies. Why? Because I really think we are meeting their expectations for one reason, as being the nationwide program that they thought we would be, engaging their constituents, honoring their veterans. But to be blunt, we are relatively speaking a low-budget item that provides big outcome and, if you will, a little bit of a political boost too. However, our challenge is continue to meet this expectation. And our challenge in all of this is ensuring we maintain their high regard on a consistent basis. We know it is critical to keep Congress informed. This requires a one-on-one conference with staff members, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day when Congress is in session. A monthly news update RSS feeds, interview donation ceremonies, wording for speeches, and annual congressional staff briefings. All these require time and staff, and every situation has to be treated as a glass ball in our daily juggling act of things that need to be done. Sometimes we go on long discussions to explain what we are really for and point out what the scope of our legislation is all about. As examples, on more than one occasion, we've had to explain to a congressional member why we wouldn't be doing interviews with certain varieties of people, such as partisan fighters in Czechoslovakia, the Hmong in Cambodia during Vietnam, or military family members. And all of them are probably due an opportunity to tell their story. Personally speaking, maybe a little selfishly speaking, particularly military family members and what they've been going through for the last 10 years. But again, our scope of our legislation is what keeps us in. All this falls out of that scope, but may represent important constituents to a member of Congress. The crux of the matter is, we must be sensitive to a congressional office's effort to support their constituents. At the same time, we need to remain within the legislative parameters and archival standards we have been given. Okay, let's talk about the Library of Congress. I think we would all agree that it's a great thing when the top person in your organization is appreciative and supportive of what you are doing. Dr. James Billington, the Library of Congress, is very interested in the Veterans History Project, and in the past has taken just about any opportunity to talk about it. I remember I was newly on board in 2006, and I had the chance to hear him doing an interview about a high-profile Library of Congress program on the Tony Danza talk show from New York City. At one point, Tony said, "Well, now it's time to take a break for a commercial message." But Dr. Billington chimed in on live TV. "Before you do, Tony, let me tell you about the Veterans History Project." And that's how Dr. Billington was in those early days of the Veterans History Project, using any opportunity, live TV and anywhere he went, to talk about us, sometimes taking a lot of time at the AFC board meetings and some other places as well. But it was all well intended. I mean, he saw the value of the project, particularly as of what I talked earlier about with our friends in Congress. Early on, his vision was that we would collect 1 million collections. It was a noble goal, but a study group analytically determined that this would exceed the total number of items that everyone else in the library takes in annually, and the preservation supply costs would run into the hundreds of millions of dollars, not to speak of staffing and other administrative costs. Nonetheless, for some time, VHP staff found themselves operating under this expectation, which at some points affected critical decisions, like just what are you going to take into this project? And there were some kind of, I think, breakdowns in some of the things we took in. Let me say here that within the last 5 years, Dr. Billington has refined his vision and now sees a goal of 100,000 collections as a major milestone we should be shooting for. And as I mentioned, we're almost there, and I think we're going to probably reach it next year. As I said, all well intended, but when the boss says things like this, you say, how high to jump and when do I come down? Meanwhile, I think others in Congress, at the library at times have seen the Veterans History Project as a congressional mandate, but not necessarily the most serious collection in the Library of Congress. They appreciate the sentiment, but not necessarily the heft of what we are about. They certainly didn't think we needed 1 million interviews. It was expected that as a project, we would have a lifespan of about 5 years. Needless to say, that didn't happen. But what did happen was about 7 years ago, we were called on to look at our standards. As I mentioned before, standards had kind of been lessened. Consider our partnerships, those that we were dealing with, and tighten our messaging. We did this, and I think it raised the opinions and expectations of some, and also made us a more serious and diverse archive. One other aspect of our relationship with the library is the exposure we have created for the Library of Congress. We have done, as I said, interviews in every state and congressional district, and as mentioned, we have touched a wide variety of organizations and institutions. We bring attention to ourselves, but more importantly, we have brought attention to the Library of Congress at a very grassroots level. And some people relate to the Library of Congress because they have heard of the Veterans History Project. Having said this, I know that VHP has lowered some of the concerns and raised some of the expectations of some in the library. And some of this is a result, quite frankly, of us getting our act together when we should have been getting our act together. For others, however, it has been a personal connection with VHP by doing an interview with someone or even submitting an interview with someone in their own family. They've got it. They understand what the project is all about, and in some ways kind of change their thought process about what we're all about. I like to think that in terms of true expectations of something important or good being done through VHP, we have our biggest job with the essence of our project, and that is our veterans. I always take the opportunity to thank any veteran who participates in the Veterans History Project. To complete the quote from Eric Severide when he expressed his pessimistic attitude about war veterans being forever strangers to us, he went on to say this with a little more optimism. If, by the miracles of art and genius in later years, 2 or 3 among them can open their hearts and the right words come, that perhaps we shall all know a little more of what it was like. Through VHP, we are asking veterans to open their hearts and their minds and relate experiences that might not come so easy. We have been able to do so through the art of oral history and through the miracle of technology that allows us more easily to collect and make accessible these stories. In encouraging veterans to open their hearts, we tell them that what they're about to do is important to the nation, of value to researchers and educators, and will be preserved and accessible for generations to come. This is a pretty tall order. Many veterans take this very seriously and see it as yet another patriotic act for their country. They are proud of their service and proud that someone cares to put it in the largest library in the world. I'd like to relate to you an experience we had that kind of gives an example of what this is all about that happened just last month. One of my staff members had been working with a gentleman by the name of Brian Caputo up in New Hampshire. And on the 4th of October, he wrote to, the gentleman's name is Owen, in my office. He said, "Thanks, Owen. This week I am to pick up 4 copied pictures from Hampton Air Force Base. Then I plan to wrap up all the packages and send them. I appreciate your long-term time and effort on my contribution. I just want to make sure everything is right." The 25th of October, we get this note from his daughter. "Dear Mr. Rogers, I'm writing you some very sad news. My dad passed away last week, was buried this past Saturday with a full military honors funeral. It was beautiful and an amazing tribute to my dad. He unfortunately had a stroke last Tuesday afternoon, but amazingly he had earlier in that day gone up to Hanscom Air Force Base to pick up the photos for his memoir, War. It was the last errand of his life, and so very important to him." So when you talk about this project, why wouldn't you put veterans first when you hear things like this happen? And this is not unusual. With some prodding, the veterans tell their stories, perhaps in a more complete way than they have ever done before. For many, as I have mentioned, it's a release. For others, it's just the same story they've been telling for the last 10, 30, 70 years. We tell those doing the interviews that it usually takes up to 4 to 6 months to process a collection once we receive it. For some reason, that word doesn't always get back to these veterans. And then the phone calls come. "Is it there yet? When am I going to be able to see it online? Is this really the Library of Congress?" For some reason, I don't think Alan Lomax had these issues. But we do. I often show in my canned briefing a picture of a World War II veteran on his 88th birthday who brought his family to the Library of Congress so they could hear his interview. It's a beautiful family photo of them hanging all over him. But he wanted them to hear his interview. And so it's just these instances, veterans are so personally invested in this project and knowing that their story is going to come to us, to the library. Expectations do run high among our veteran participants, for we are preserving and making accessible a part of their life that has shaped them, defined them, and good or bad, as something they want respected. Should also say that this is translated from family members as well. They too have expectations that their veterans' account will be preserved and presented and accessible. A brief comment about accessibility, it's going to be very brief. I said about 15% of the VHP archive is digitized. 5 years ago, quite frankly, I probably think that would have been a pretty good number. In today's world of YouTube, social media, smartphones, you name it, many of our participants want to know when the interview will be online. Meaning, when can they see it on my laptop, my phone, my whatever? This is a real challenge that requires a separate conversation, as I suspect, but I also suspect it will be a bigger issue for us later down the road, because we will never, ever digitize everything we have. So how are we meeting the expectations of our veterans and their families? I'd like to say that to be a VHP staff member, you got to have a heart. Unfortunately, I have a staff that has just that. You also have to have the ability to patiently apply the standards we have set for our interviews. We have conversations with veterans and their families every day about the status of a collection, the need for a copy of an interview. Veterans are supposed to be provided a copy of their interview when it's done, and too often that doesn't happen, and we end up having to do that. Why we may have returned to collection, because it didn't quite meet our standards. For those of you who weren't here for this afternoon's session, I talked about that. One of the big things we require is that any interview be at least 30 minutes long, and some have gone on for hours. But that's been kind of one of these standards that we've had set that we've had to hold pretty strongly by. Or how someone can veterans asking how someone can be interviewed. Situations like this require tact and understanding and a willingness to listen. I think we have a little bit of a unique situation that we have an archive of oral histories that has voices that come along with them. Voices that can call you up, can email you, that want to talk to you. Veterans and their family members do feel a certain entitlement with the expectations we have created for them. Again, it is something that takes extra effort and resourcing. So let's talk about those who are collecting our interviews, our participants. They too require a lot of tact and patience, and there are literally thousands of those who over the years have been involved in collecting the interviews and materials that make up the Veterans History Project. They span a whole swath of experience. Many come from with high expectations of collecting multitudes of interviews, with some actually conducting hundreds. However, most, a whole lot most, actually only do a far lower number. Most come without training or any academic background in oral histories. And what they find that it doesn't happen as easily as it might appear. As I said, our standards are set, a 30-minute interview. If we talk about, I haven't talked much about original materials, but also people can submit photographs, letters, diaries, but again, keeping to a library standard, these have to be the original copies of these, and we ask for so many of them. And we all want them all to be properly documented. And any of you who've done some of this, as you know, the interview itself is usually probably the easiest and most enjoyable part. It's all those logistics that you have to go through. Equipment, location, paperwork, dubbing, shipping that makes it hard. We try to overcome that with our Veterans History Project Field Kit, which I have copies of if you'd like to grab one on your way out, and a 15-minute companion video. This lays out things on the how-to basis of how to do an interview. More recently, we've even added in some do's and don'ts to try to make it as simple as possible and to simplify it so that hopefully anyone can do it. Also, we have the prerequisite FAQs to round it all out. Better alternative in all this, though, that we try to help some of these folks that are having problems, is to offer our Veterans History Project workshops that are so well done by members of the American Folklore Society or the Oral History Association. We hope to do, and usually do, between 25 and 30 of these face-to-face instruction sessions every year. At the end, though, by encouraging our participants to follow the rules and get some level of instruction, we are in some way testing their commitment to the project. A lot of people fall out, but once a lot of people get the bug and get what we're trying to do, they can be pretty stalwart in their support. For many of those who actually do figure out some expectations are exceeded in regard to the personal reward they get from the interaction with these veterans. The next group are researchers. Ultimately, as I said, anything that comes to the library is there for research, and we have educators, researchers, general public coming in with a specific interest. I mentioned that we get our fair share of researchers with an array of interests, and they too have expectations they need met. The Veterans History Project research experience is a little different from others at the Library of Congress, I think primarily due to the materials we serve, and in the way in which we need to serve it. Researchers who come to us are looking for personal accounts with the expectations that VHP will somehow be able to weed through the 95,000 collections we have to meet their needs. In most cases, all they have to go on, just like with anyone probably doing some initial research, is what they get out of our database, which has very limited information about the veteran themselves, and also the quality of their interview and some of the specifics of what they've talked about. They've been unable to review the interview unless it's been digitized. And since only 50% are digitized, I will say that we are making efforts to expand that. I don't want to talk that down too much. So up to this point, this is pretty much like anyone else is coming to the library. But then the process becomes a little more customized. Our single reference specialists must then work with the researcher one-on-one to mine their results. And when they generally need to make And generally, they need to make reading copies of the interviews. We have to make a reading copy from the original on any interview we serve. And in some cases, we have to retrieve the material at our storage facilities up at Fort Meade. It just isn't like a walk-in experience and pulling things off the shelf. It takes a little work, it takes a little time, and it takes just a little bit more than maybe some people have experienced in the library. Researchers require us to be consistent in making the message known that these things do take time and we do have to put some extra effort into it. Something that I think about a lot is whether we are able to give researchers literally everything that they may need. What I mean by this is we have not been able to do a thorough analysis of our archive. With 125 new collections every week and the expectation that they will be processed expeditiously, we have not had the chance to discover all the gems that we have in our possession. We need to do a more thorough listening to our interviews. We don't listen to all the interviews. And a gap analysis of our collection needs to be done. Again, a matter of time and resourcing. We do get kudos, though, from researchers for the volume of our archive, its variety, as well as the very moving personal accounts that they are able to hear. I think this is a tribute to our veterans, and I think it's a tribute to those who, more importantly, the interviewers who get this information out of our veterans. They all almost all are amateurs. They are doing a great job. I'll relate just to give you an idea who is using this archive. Last week, we had a woman, Mary Donan, who was the previous archivist and director of Dartmouth University Oral History Project. She was there doing research for Jim Wright, who is the president emeritus of Dartmouth, who was writing a book about Vietnam and Vietnam veterans during a particular time during the Vietnam War. She couldn't be more effusive in her compliments about the collections, about what she was seeing. She actually asked if she could camp out in the AFC reading room. We told her she couldn't. But it was also very satisfying for all of us to hear her say that to have someone of that magnitude talk about us and promise, of course, to spread the word. So, let's talk about you, folklorists and oral historians. Granted, I am not an expert in this field, but I do have a lot of people back at the Library of Congress that I can call upon to talk about whether or not we can discern if we are meeting the expectations of oral historians and folklorists. I understand that from the beginning, the AFC staff depended upon folklorists and oral historians to provide advice and counsel on what this project should be and how it could be done. They applied good principles in guidance that came out for the field kit and for handling the archive of the collections. Still, I suspect there were some doubters in regard to the rigor of the interview process, the substance of the stories, and the reliance on volunteers. So expectations might not always have been high for the results. Yet here we are, 14 years later. A key to our continued success has been the consistent support received from the American Folklore Society. And I really don't say this lightly because we're here today, but Tim Lloyd has been a champion for this project from absolutely the very beginning, and is working with members of the society through our workshops that has really made us be able to provide, and the Oral History Association, provide professionals that can go out in the field and teach some of these people about doing these interviews. It's been very gratifying to see that. We've done over 300 workshops around the country. We've also been given guidance and support from the American Folklife Center Board of Trustees, some of whom have actually been VHP interviews. And as I mentioned, we have tightened our standards, dispositioned some of the collections that we received, and refined our instructions. So in general, I like to think we are reaching, in the broader sense, the expectations of folklore and oral history. But I'll let you be the judge of this, and I ask you to consider some of these statements. VHP supports the idea of the intergenerational passing of stories and preservation of memory within families and communities. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of things that folklorists are accomplishing to do. VHP educates at the local level the process and importance of collecting history and historical items, also listening to these stories and participating in the process. VHP places folklore and oral history in the political realm on a national basis. We are exposing Congress to the value of both disciplines and potentially finding some funding for future initiatives of this sort. As an example, the Civil Rights Oral History Act, which was done over the last couple of years, was also a part, we think, an outgrowth of how well we had done with VHP. VHP raises the discussion of what is oral history and what is folklore. If you're here this afternoon, you heard some of that. It also preserves our culture. I am convinced that one day a handwritten letter, like thousands we have, will probably be like the wax cylinders that we have from the 19th century. They'll be a thing of times past, and will be a treasured item to be able to put your hands on. So, I'll leave you with these statements, and also would offer you any comments anyone would like to make about them for further discussion. But let me just say this in conclusion, that VHP, particularly the hardworking VHP staff, I feel, is meeting the challenges that has been given of creating a nationwide archive while meeting, in the most part, the expectations of those who look at us in different ways. However, I also think we face a future of keeping up with technology that will cause expectations to be raised on the collections and the archiving of interviews. I will tell you that we look forward to this challenge with a consistent aim of creating an authoritative and diverse collection that also honors those who have served and sacrificed for our nation. I thank you for your attendance here today. I thank you for your attention. Let me make one more paid political announcement. Next week is Veterans Day. And we at the Veterans History Project talk about Veterans Day. It's certainly a day when we commemorate our veterans. We pay honor to our veterans. We thank our veterans. But we also ask people to make it a little bit more meaningful. Talk to our veterans. Capture their stories. Next month is a time, in the next couple of months, it's a great time during the holidays when families are together, and it's an excellent time to do that. And we encourage you to do that, to make next Veterans Day a little bit more meaningful. Again, thank you for being here tonight. If we want to have some questions, I'll be glad to take them. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am. What is the role? The Red Cross, there's an arm of the American Red Cross called Service to the Armed Forces. And we've had a number of Red Cross chapters. Part of it is giving something for their volunteer base to do. When there aren't blood drives or aren't disasters, they want to keep their volunteers involved. And so by using this arm of support to the armed forces, they have been doing Veterans History Project interviews. So the Long Beach, California chapter of the Veterans History Project has done almost 300 interviews in the last couple of years. A very dedicated person out there doing it. But that's how the Red Cross gets involved, and been very beneficial for us. Anybody else? Yes, Linda.
What does when you talked about digitizing the collections as they come in, what does the digitizing process entail?
Well, it's primarily done by contract, and we have to turn over our media to them, and it goes out and comes back on portable hard drives that we then have to put on our servers and make part of the collection. And someone asked me this afternoon, what's the priority on digitization? And it varies. We do a series through our website called Experiencing War, where we highlight different parts of the collections. And we will send those off to be digitized almost automatically. But we also are doing as a part of preservation, too, where we have some media like VHS tapes and some other mini DVs that we no longer take anymore, but we have that we need to get digitized. And some stories are just got to be digitized. They're just so good we have to get them out for people to be exposed to. But also part of digitizing some of these is to bring attention to various parts of the collections that we want more of, like women, like Hispanics, some of these groups that we've highlighted.
So depending on what the source is, that will influence whether it gets priority in terms of being digitized sooner versus later?
The source?
Whether it comes from a place where you've got a recognized gap in the collection.
Yes, yes.
And the collections, are transcripts part of the digitization process?
No. We don't ask for when they're submitted to be transcribed. We do ask for a summary to be done of the interviews so you kind of get an idea. But the National Court Reporters Association, the people who do the little thing in court, took this on 10 years ago, I think now, that as a part of their continuing education, we would feed them VHP interviews and they would transcribe them. Going back to the very beginning, Congressman Kine's wife was a court reporter and she thought this would be a great idea, and it was a great idea. But we've had over 3,000 transcripts done. In fact, make that 3,500, because this Veterans Day, we hit 3,500. We're making a big deal of it. 3,500 transcripts have been done. If you're a researcher, you appreciate having a transcript. It's a lot easier. So that's what the transcription's all about.
Nice.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
The fact that so many of the interviewers are amateurs, ranging from Boy Scout groups,
Yeah.
high schoolers,
Middle schoolers.
I wondered about the kind of training that they get in terms of methodology. A friend of mine is a high school teacher
Mhm.
and would have his students go and interview veterans, and he said a problem that he had was that they didn't understand the sensitivity that they needed, and he would have to stop people when they'd say, "How many people did you kill?"
Yeah. Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
they would ask a question that was so open-ended, like, "So what was Europe like?" And which really
Yeah.
doesn't leave anything that's all that useful
Exactly.
for a researcher who wants to use it. So how does the program help interviewers to know how to be sensitive and get good information out of their informants?
Well, first of all, we encourage, we say it very loud and clear in our field kit that we should be 10th grade and above. We know that doesn't always happen. We've had good interviews. Some of it if they go through the workshop, that comes out, they have like 2.5 hours worth of training. And we do the best we can with their 15-minute interview. But part of it is, particularly with the teacher, that some of that has to be done by the classroom. We just don't have one thing. I mean, as we were talking this morning, well, Dana can tell you about it. She just did how many years of study to be an oral historian? But it's. Do you want to speak to that, Dana?
About those issues?
About training younger people?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a concern, especially with sensitive topics and trauma, and that's why I think if students interview somebody they know and that they're closer to, that usually works out better because they tend to have like the emotional intelligence to, and then the person also, I think, is a little less likely to be offended or to take it the wrong way, but it is definitely an issue with students.
Yeah, the classic case we had, and I hate to rag on a student, but it was this young man interviewing a veteran, and he had all his questions, and the veteran was talking about, and there we stood on the deck of the ship, and 2 Japanese torpedoes crashed right into the side, and this great explosion, and everybody was thrown everywhere. It was just horrible. And the young man goes, "And how was the food?" And it's just, and that's why we try to. But I tell you, I mean, for high schoolers, they'll do a pretty good job. But that's another thing I talk about this project too. The intergenerational piece of it is essential, I think. The most magic thing you can do is sit an 18-year-old down with someone who is a veteran of Korea, Vietnam, World War II, and say, "What were you doing when you were 18 years old?" And it kind of opens their mind. You had a question?
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask, in terms of the interviews that have been conducted, is there, like, what's sort of the ratio of the audio versus video? Is video very prevalent?
Video is becoming much more prevalent. Audio early on was what a lot of people used, and it was cassettes and that kind of thing. But video is becoming much more prevalent, but it's a lot easier to handle.
And even with, like, people who aren't using the highest quality, does it generally, do you generally get pretty okay?
It's pretty okay because cameras today are pretty
Yeah.
okay, and so yeah, we tell people to use the best that they can,
Yeah.
but yeah, they're pretty okay. Christy, you have a question?
Yeah, and this is probably something that you guys talked about in the panel this afternoon, but the context of storytelling, shapes the stories that get told so often. So even if it's the interviewer is sensitive, in particular, if the interviewer is someone that the veteran is close to, you're going to get a particular kind of representation of self that is specific to that moment. And there have been some interesting success stories with interviews happening within a community. I'm thinking like Carl Lindahl's project with Katrina survivors interviewing each other. And one of the first projects I was ever involved in was the Northside Folklore project in Ireland, which was had a bunch of people within the community interviewing each other, which is an interesting challenge to transcribe because there's no specific stories. There's collaborative storytelling events. And in some ways, this is a much more naturalistic way for stories to function. And in my own research, when I interviewed veterans, I realized that a lot of times they were defining storytelling specifically as essentially shared memory, as a particular moment when you're reconstructing an event with people who are co-present, not the transmission of narrative to a different audience outside of that moment. And that was what they framed as really successful storytelling, even though there's no movement of information.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether it's possible or within the scope of an oral history, is that something that's purely the domain of ethnography, or is there a space for that in oral history?
I would defer to someone who could answer much better than I on that. If anyone else in the room has anybody in the back there? I think it may be the question that will go unanswered, Christy, but we'll get back to you. Yes, Linda.
So you said that now you're at about 95,000?
Yeah.
And that the original mandate of 1 million
That was one man's vision.
was scaled back to 100,000.
Yeah.
You're almost there.
Yeah.
Another year.
That's a milestone.
That's a milestone. So what happens after that?
We keep going.
Keep going.
I mean, there's 17 million living wartime veterans. Yes, Nikki? You got, okay. No. I mean, there's 17 million living wartime veterans, and we will never get all of them. But again, yeah, I mean, we've got a whole new batch for the last 10 years. As I said, we've only done so much of Vietnam, and some of us have been talking about the importance of capturing the story of Vietnam and making sure the whole Vietnam story is told. Again, there's going to be a lot of emphasis on Vietnam, I think, in the next 5 years or so, 10 years or so, as that group starts going away, but also as we start commemorating some of this. So it's ongoing.
So there's no concern that once that 100,000
Oh, no.
milestone is reached, that Congress is suddenly going to go, you know what, this project,
Yeah.
I'm not really sure.
I just don't see any sense of that. And again, as we said, we've got all these other new vets. And, part of this is recognizing that service, and we have to do that. So, Nikki, you, and then David. Yeah.
Have you sat down as an interviewee for this project?
Have I?
And if so, can you talk about it?
Yeah, I've been interviewed. I held off doing an interview for many years. And part of it was I was in the Vietnam era. I didn't go to Vietnam. I was in the Army for 28 years, and I will freely admit I never heard a shot fired in anger. I was in Berlin. I was in Korea doing some very interesting times. And, I mean, this is the thing, like a lot of veterans. It's like, I didn't do anything. I know I did, and I'm proud of what I did, but, you know, is it something that and that's the obstacle you got to overcome with a lot of these veterans is, you know, tell your story. And we always emphasize every story is important. It's not just the Hollywood and TV stuff. It's every story is important. So I recognized I had to practice what I preached and all that kind of thing. And I'm really glad I did, because I had fun doing it, really, actually. So, but thanks. It isn't on, it didn't digitize yet, though. There have been threats. Yes, sir.
So, what do you do with stories that may not sit well with the public or with the perspective of other veterans? Certainly you must have conflicting stories.
Well, we do. And an oral history is one person's perspective. It's one person's experience, and that's what that we tell everybody. You know, this is not trying to prove fact or prove or disprove history or something like that. And I have had, I mean, example a few months ago, Senator Hagel has done a couple of interviews with us, and some guy called up and said, "I was in that unit. He didn't do all that stuff. Yada yada yada." I said, "Fine. Why don't you tell the story?" I challenged him. You go out and tell your story of what that was all about. And we have a disclaimer that you know, we don't verify the information in the story. It's the individual's story. It is what it is. And we have had people who have, as I just said, who've expressed some disgust at what's been said, and have just said that's his outlook on it. So, is that kind of what you were talking about, or? Okay. Yeah.
Have you had a situation where members of Congress had a problem with content that's archived?
No. As a matter of fact, we haven't. They've been very supportive. It's interesting. We had a researcher come through several years ago from the Netherlands who wanted to talk to members of Congress who are Vietnam veterans and talk to them about how that experience had affected their process of governing and being in Congress and making decisions, those kind of things. We've tried to get as many members of Congress as possible to participate in the project. As you're aware, that's kind of a diminishing demographic too. Although I noticed this morning we got some new members that we need to get. But they have never tried to rein us in on anything we have done other than to try to expand us in areas that we just can't expand into. Anybody else? Yes, Betsy.
When you were putting stories online, what is your criteria for what is a good story? I mean, what makes a good story?
It's generally one that kind of resonates with what we're trying to talk about. And in the case of medical things, we make sure that we get good doctor stories and nurse stories and those kind of things. I mean, it doesn't have to be quality, but it is of enough quality that we can put it online so that people can understand it and see it, hear it, and all that kind of business. I think that's about it. And fortunately, we have a lot of those. So it isn't a challenge for us, I don't think. We had new ones went up this week on World War I, and that's the 100th year of World War I, anniversary of the beginning of World War I. So we were able to get about 350 actual collections out of World War I veterans. Not all of them are oral histories, but we do have a few to include Frank Buckles, the last World War I veteran. And?
Oh, no, I heard of them.
Huh? Oh. I'm sorry, am I missing something?
No, I was just impressed. That's great.
Oh, okay, good.
I read about it.
Oh, okay. Anybody else? Well, Well, thank you. I appreciate you being here. Have a great evening, and talk to you the better you like.